So I'm a maths teacher at Barr's Hill. I trained 4 years ago, and I've been doing a part-time master's in character education over the past 3 years at the Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtues at the University of Birmingham. And I've been especially interested in this question, the role of rewards in character education, and I'll say a lot more about that in a moment. And it's led naturally into a PhD that I'm now doing at the Jubilee Centre, and I thought I'd say something else as well about educational research in general. I mean, Nick kind of got us started off, but I think many teachers are proto-researchers. Okay, I think that many research questions regularly crop up in the minds of many teachers. So I think as a teacher, you'll often think, if I do X, it'll bring about a certain outcome and that will benefit my students. But within the context of teaching, we're very busy, and it's very hard to have any real confidence, I would say, in those sorts of causal connections. So you do X to bring about Y, okay, and it seems to work, but how do you really know that what you did brought about the outcome that you saw? It's very difficult to answer that in the context of a school. And secondly, how do you know that the outcome you brought about is truly going to benefit your students? It's going to, improve their life chances, or more generally improve their lives. Those are really difficult questions, and I think that's part of the value of having some familiarity with educational research and knowing where to look. It can help you answer these sorts of questions, okay? Establish these causal connections between the interventions you're implementing and the outcomes you're hoping to achieve, and also help you think about whether those outcomes are really in the best interest of students. So I think that that's part of the value of educational research. Nick mentioned a moment ago about the importance of having kind of theory-informed practice, or getting the theory into the practice. I think I'd also like to add that it's really important to go the other direction as well, and to try and get practice-informed theory. Okay, I think what's happening with this lecture series is a really nice way to bring research into schools. I think the next big question to ask is how to get practitioners into the research institutions, into universities. Yeah, I mean, maybe we can discuss that more later in the Q&A. But yeah, it's fantastic that this lecture series is happening. Okay, so I'll get straight into this now. So let's have a look. So character and motivation. So I think that most people would agree. In fact, this is probably a requirement for being a teacher, I would say, that education should prepare young people to lead good lives. I think most teachers would agree with that. And then obviously you start to have arguments over what it means to lead a good life. Okay, and you're straight into kind of some quite philosophical territory. Okay, well, obviously one of the big names in philosophy is Aristotle. Okay, but so for Aristotle, if he was thinking about how to prepare young people to lead good lives, for him that would mean cultivating in them moral virtues. Okay, things like courage, justice, honesty, compassion, gratitude, and humility. Okay, now I do want to linger on this for a moment, because I think it's really, really important. This is one category of virtues, the moral virtues. There are two other main categories of virtues. You've got performance virtues, things like determination and resilience and team working skills, stuff like that. You might describe them as CV virtues. And you've also got intellectual virtues, things like curiosity. Okay, so you've got your performance and your intellectual virtues. Sometimes they're described as CV or resume virtues, whereas these moral virtues are sometimes described as eulogy virtues. Okay, so your intellectual and your performance virtues are the things you might discuss on a CV, But after you're gone and people are discussing the sort of life you lead, you probably wouldn't want them to talk about your, I don't know, your team working skills. It would seem out of place. They're more likely to discuss these things. And that's based on the intuition that this sort of stuff is actually what really matters. This sort of stuff really matters. Okay, there's a lot of emphasis on the performance and the intellectual virtues in schools, but this stuff really matters. Okay, and in fact, if you haven't got a core set of moral virtues, the other sorts of virtues, the performance virtues and the intellectual virtues, can kind of be aimless. You know, you might be determined, but what are you determined to do? Ideally, you'll be determined to make the world a fairer, more honest, more kind place. Okay, but if you haven't got that moral guidance, that moral compass, where does your determination go? What's it directed towards? You know, self-interest. I mean, take a look at the 2008 banking crisis. You had a lot of bankers who were really competent, you know, technically. I'm sure very, very clever people. What they lacked, arguably, was a moral compass, you know, and they engaged in all sorts of practices which ultimately caused great harm. Okay, and it's similar for the intellectual virtues as well. You know, curiosity in itself isn't necessarily a good thing. Okay, ask the cat that curiosity killed. So the point I'm trying to make is this is the stuff that really matters, okay? And there's actually been a turn back towards Aristotle in research probably in the last 60 to 70 years, and it's definitely filtered through into practice in the last kind of 15 to 20 years, I would say. Educators were worried that the education was a bit too careerist, okay? The value of education had been instrumentalized, okay? It was about getting young people to have a certain sort of career later down the line, and that justified the whole enterprise of education, okay? But it was education very narrowly conceived. And like I said, the system was turning out people who were very competent, but perhaps without that moral guidance and that moral compass. Okay, so the turn back towards Aristotle was especially appealing because Aristotle's got a really rich view of what it means to lead a good life. Okay, it's not just about the sort of career you get, it's not just about social status, it's not even really about whether you're happy or not. He's got a really rich, detailed account of what it means to lead a good life. And the word that you might see bandied about is flourishing. So that's the English translation of Aristotle's word eudaimonia, which means to lead a good life. And so you might ask, okay, so flourishing, that's what Aristotle thinks we should all aim for. But what is it to flourish? You know, it's just an abstract word. What does it actually mean to flourish? Well, to bring it back to these virtues, it means to be courageous and just and honest and compassionate and grateful and humble. Okay? These virtues are seen to constitute flourishing. They're part of flourishing. Okay, so if you're doing these things, you're not just preparing for a good life later down the line. You're actually, in a real sense, already having a good life, a flourishing life, if you're doing these things. And that's another really important aspect of Aristotle. He thought we learnt by doing. Okay, we learnt by doing. Okay, so I did want to focus on that just for a moment to kind of get across that crucial distinction between the moral virtues that really matter, and on an intuitive level, I think we all know they really matter, and perhaps the emphasis on some schools, on the more performance, more intellectual-based virtues. Okay, without these moral virtues, you know, those extra skills can be aimless and even dangerous. Okay, right now, okay, let's get on to the topic of motivation. So we've got this list of virtues, but Aristotle said that an act is virtuous only if it's chosen for its own sake. Okay, so if a child is kind for the sake of kindness, great, that's a virtuous action. If they're kind only for the sake of a reward or for social approval, it's not really virtuous. Okay, they might be on the path to virtue, but at that point it's not fully virtuous, if at all. Okay, so it matters that we choose to be good for the sake of goodness itself. Okay, and accordingly, many modern programs of character education place great emphasis on intrinsic motivation. So that's what that claim is often translated as meaning, okay? It's important that we choose virtue for its own sake. Therefore, intrinsic motivation is really, really important, okay? Really important. And I'll say more about intrinsic motivation in just a moment. In fact, I'll say it now, okay? So intrinsic motivation is important. There are different types of motivation. So motivation is that which energizes and gives direction to our behaviour. It's what moves us. Okay, that MOT at the start of the word motivation, you see it in motor and motion. It's about movement, it's about behaviour, okay? And there are different types of motivation. Okay, so if a behaviour is performed for its inherent satisfaction, so feelings of interest or enjoyment, we describe that as intrinsic motivation, okay? If the behaviour is performed instrumentally as a means to an end, that's extrinsic motivation. Okay, so if a child draws a picture for the love of drawing, they're intrinsically motivated. They draw it for a reward, they're extrinsically motivated. Okay. Now, this distinction here is perhaps a little too sharp. There are, in fact, different types of extrinsic motivation, which can be more or less autonomous. And this is what's often glossed over and missed out in discussions on extrinsic motivation. So, external motivation, for example, would be acting for rewards or to avoid a punishment. Okay, introjected motivation is really, really interesting. Introjected motivation is where we behave for an internal reward, so feelings of pride or to avoid feelings of guilt. Okay, if you've ever kind of wanted to do something and you hear. So a good way to characterise introjected motivation is, you know, you have the angels of your better nature and then the devil on your shoulder whispering in your ear. That's kind of introjected motivation. If you were ever going to do something and you kind of heard the voice of a parent or a teacher in the back of your head saying, oh no, don't do that, you shouldn't do that, that would be introjected motivation. Okay. Also got identified motivation, which is where you find what you're doing to be personally important, and then integrated motivation all the way up here at the end, where what you're doing fully coheres with all of your values. Okay, it's properly integrated into your identity. And a good example here, just to illustrate the difference, is many children, when they're little, will brush their teeth in order to not get in trouble. Okay, as you get older, you brush your teeth because you personally value practices of good hygiene. Okay, brushing your teeth over that period hasn't gotten any more enjoyable. But your motivation has changed. Okay, so it's still extrinsic motivation, okay, but it's more autonomous. You've gone from doing it to avoid a punishment to doing it because you personally value hygiene. It's still extrinsic motivation, but it's more autonomous, okay? And you might be able to say that over that period, you've undergone a process of internalization, okay? You've taken an external value and turned it into your own, okay? And that is typically what in the literature, when character educationists are talking about intrinsic motivation, they actually seem to be referring more generally to autonomous motivation. Okay, so motivation that's gone from an external place to a more internal place. Someone's taken an external value and kind of turned it into their own. That's typically what they mean when they discuss intrinsic motivation. Okay, right, good. Now, so I think what we've established is that intrinsic motivation or autonomous motivation is really important for character education, character development, okay, because an act is virtuous only if you choose it for its own sake. Now this creates an issue, okay, the threat of rewards, okay, they do pose a serious threat, okay. Many schools rely heavily on extrinsic rewards, things like stickers and certificates and points. At Barr's Hill we have pride points. We even seem to have implicit competitions among staff on who can kind of give out the most pride points. So we've kind of got, and competition, by the way, is also a form of extrinsic motivation. So we've got a system in place that extrinsically motivates teachers to extrinsically motivate students, kind of all stacking, this whole system stacking up on top of each other. Okay. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with rewards. Learning how to kind of engage in unappealing behaviours as a means to more appealing outcomes, that's kind of the essence of perseverance. And it's also kind of involved in when we talk about delaying gratification. You know, that's kind of what we're getting at. So there's nothing inherently problematic with rewards, but it does pose a serious problem for character education, because rewards have been shown to undermine intrinsic motivation. So if you have a child who's drawn a picture for the love of drawing, and you give them a reward for doing so, they're going to be more likely to see drawing as something they do to get a reward. So it can undermine their intrinsic motivation for that reason. Okay. So I mean, if you take these facts together, then this suggests that many schools are potentially hostile environments for character development. You know, if intrinsic motivation is really important, and many schools are awash with extrinsic motivation, especially rewards, and rewards undermine intrinsic motivation, you know, you're in character development's in trouble. And this does seem to propose a dilemma. Okay. This does seem to present a dilemma for character educationists, okay? So what do you do? And when I say character educationists, I mean anyone who's interested in character education, not just kind of the researchers in universities. So do you denounce rewards and risk alienating many schools, you know, which rely heavily on rewards? Or do you embrace instrumentalism and kind of undermine the whole enterprise of character education? You know, this isn't a dilemma it's not a pleasant dilemma here. This does pose a serious problem for character education. Thankfully, some people have suggested a third way, a way out of the dilemma, and that is to use rewards to encourage initial participation in certain behaviours in students who are initially unmotivated. Okay, unmotivated. But there's currently no evidence. There's no evidence for that particular proposition, and that's the proposition that I tried to test with this experiment at Barr's Hill. Okay, so that's a moment at which I think it's good to pause for any questions or comments, because I've covered a lot of ground. Is there any questions at this point, or comments or thoughts? There will be kind of a Q&A at the end as well. But
could you just explain the concept of instrumentalism?
Yes, yeah. So great question. So instrumentalism is where you do something as a means to an end. Okay, so in this context here, if you were if you just kind of gave in to the pressure of rewards and thought they're everywhere, can't do anything about it, we're just going to have to try and deal with it. That would be kind of giving into instrumentalism, because rewards are they're used to motivate children to do things as a means to an end. The end being the reward. Does that make sense? Yeah. Any other questions at this point? Yeah, go on.
So you use pride points.
Yeah, that's right.
Pride points linked to any, that is the actual award, or is there another secondary award that comes from having X amount of pride points?
Yes, so
how does that link to one after the other?
Yeah. So I'll get more into that in a moment, but that's a really good question. So pride points at Barr's Hill kind of function as a currency. So, you know, students can accumulate them.
We're about to, high school Hinks was about to launch Pride Shop on Monday.
There you go, Pride Shops.
I worry if you're about to dismantle all that.
Yeah, so it's exactly the same at Barr's Hill. Yeah, they function as a currency. A teacher who left a few years ago described, and I think he hit the nail on the head really, pride points in a lot of cases are a way of buying good behaviour from students, and they can then go and use that money to buy themselves sweets or stationery or footballs or whatever. Yeah, so it's currency basically. Okay, cool. Yes, go on, Callum.
So you say rewards undermine intrinsic motivation.
Yeah.
And you said that this is what the literature said.
Yeah.
I'm quite interested to know if you know exactly what the methodology was, what the experiment was, how they came to this conclusion.
Great question, because that leads into the next section. Right, so let's do that. Yeah, go on, Chris. Say again. Go on.
It's an airy-fairy comment.
Yeah.
One of my experiences would be over the years that the very weakest practitioners, be it pastoral or teachers, struggle to implement the system, whatever the system, rewards included, behaviour, whatever. The very best practitioners, the outstanding practitioners, often don't bother using the system because they don't need to. And I've always thought that tells us something about actually that system is not what's generating the outcome. It's a prop for people, and the very best practitioners actually don't use it.
Yeah, like scaffolding. Yeah, I think, I mean, some of the best practitioners that spring into my mind immediately, and they make very little use of it. I think they have wonderful ways of tapping into a more internal source of motivation in young people and just kind of do it intuitively.
Just what do you mean by that? Do you mean best teachers don't give rewards out?
Outstanding teachers don't follow the rules.
They don't do it.
They just make it work. They typically don't use the DT system. They don't need to, because the kids just
Don't get DT.
Don't get DT, and they don't bother using the reward system because they can't be bothered to fill the form in. They don't need to, because the kids are getting it right and the kids feel positively rewarded, and actually they do it all a different way.
So they're offering rewards in a different fashion.
Well, I don't know, let's find out, but I've always been interested by that, because I think, but I would say that applies to all systems, that outstanding teachers, they don't follow the rules.
Yeah, so perhaps they're offering a different type of reward. That's an interesting way of thinking about it, a less tangible type of reward, in fact, I mean, I'll just name her because she'll love it when she watches the video back. Wendy Stamper at Barr's Hill, a wonderful teacher. When I first started there, she just seemed to have this magical effect over students, and I couldn't figure it out. Like, it was a real puzzle, and it drove me mad. I was like, what's Wendy Stamper doing? And I didn't want to kind of just rest on the explanation that she's kind of, a more senior member of staff, kind of this matriarchal figure. I wasn't satisfied with that. I wanted to kind of really understand what she was doing. And doing my masters at the same time kind of helped me figure it out a bit quicker. And I think that's kind of one of the other benefits of doing research. It helps you kind of pinpoint what it is that the best teachers do, and you can figure it out a bit quicker. You might have figured it out anyway, but you might be able to figure it out in 3 years rather than 10. Right, cool. So I'll move on, because Callum's question leads directly into the next section. So, okay, good. So I'll say a bit more about this undermining effect. So the argument over rewards began in the 1960s in psychology, so in the psychological literature, began in the 1960s. At that point, behaviourism had been the dominant paradigm for about 50 years, but it was starting to lose its influence. The so-called cognitive revolution was coming in and kind of sweeping the behaviourist paradigm to one side. But it's still important, I think, to kind of start with behaviourism here if we're going to understand this undermining effect. So according to behaviourism, essentially, all motivation is extrinsic. Okay, the technical way of saying it is that all voluntary behaviour is controlled by external contingencies of reinforcement, but that basically just means that all motivation is extrinsic. And intrinsic motivation is just an illusion. Okay, you might think you're intrinsically motivated, but really you don't know what you're talking about. And if you had a more penetrating understanding of the true sources of your motivation, you'd know actually that they existed beyond yourself. The motivation wasn't coming from within. It ultimately comes from outside. You just can't figure out where. And so you say, I'm intrinsically motivated. And there's still quite a lot of psychologists who believe this sort of thing. Behaviourism has kind of morphed into what's called functional analytics now, but you still get whole journals of psychologists thinking this way. Intrinsic motivation is an illusion. Now, on this view, this should mean that motivation should be additive. Okay, so I'll explain that. If Callum's working on a puzzle, and he's motivated to work on this puzzle, it appears like he's intrinsically motivated to work on this puzzle, but really we know that he's extrinsically motivated, because ultimately all motivation is extrinsically motivated. And then I give him a reward on top of what he's already doing. Okay, his total motivation should go up whilst I'm offering this reward, and then when the reward has gone away, his motivation should return to where it was initially. Okay, so that's kind of what it means by additive. You introduce a reward, motivation goes up, take it away, motivation goes back down to where it had originally been. Okay, that's what that means. And a psychologist, famous psychologist, Deci, decided to test this idea, and he found that it wasn't true. Okay, so Callum was interested in the puzzles. I came along, gave him a reward, for engaging in the puzzles, and then when I took the reward away, his motivation didn't return to where it was originally, and it in fact went below, it went down. Okay, he lost motivation. And they described this as an undermining effect. So his original motivation for engaging in the interesting puzzle was undermined by this reward. Okay, and that suggests that intrinsic motivation, it's not an illusion. It is a fundamentally different kind of motivation, and it is seemingly undermined by rewards. Okay, so that's the undermining effect. That gave birth to self-determination theory, which some of you might have heard of. And this undermining effect was soon replicated. They repeated the experiments. They showed that it occurred in educational contexts and in moral contexts. Okay, it's a very interesting experiment where they had lots of very young children. I think they were 15 months old, and they tested this undermining effect with helping behaviours. So I do like this experiment. The experimenter would sit in a room and drop a pen and reach for it, and it's just out of reach, and they start making all these dramatic noises like, oh, I can't reach the pen, I can't reach the pen. And toddlers, even at the age of like 15 months, a lot of them will go and pick up the pen and hand it back to the experimenter. And they gave some of the toddlers a reward, and some of the toddlers didn't get a reward for this helping behaviour. And they showed that subsequently, when they did more trials, the toddlers who'd received the reward helped less afterwards than the toddlers who hadn't received the reward. So this undermining effect seems to be ubiquitous. It's really well established. There's a lot of evidence for it. Okay, and this was the explanation. So I'll read it out. Whereas initially participants had been doing the activity because it was interesting and enjoyable, those in reward conditions, so those are the participants who are receiving the reward, came to view the activity as something they did in order to get a reward. Okay, so the intrinsically motivated behaviour has been instrumentalised, and the intrinsic motivation has therefore been undermined. Okay, right, now let's see how this applies, or how one particular influential person has tried to apply this argument in the context of character education. So Marvin Berkowitz, he's probably the main, he's probably the kind of the leader of character education research in the United States. He's quite famous in this field of research in the States, and he is firmly against rewards for the reasons that we've discussed. He believes intrinsic motivation is essential for character development. Extrinsic rewards undermine intrinsic motivation, as we've just been discussing, and so therefore rewards have no place in character education. Okay, it's a straightforward argument. It makes sense. However, this is a misapplication of self-determination theory. He's got it wrong, and I've had this argument with him via email. Not quite via email. I submitted a paper to his journal explaining why he was wrong, which is kind of a bit of a silly move in retrospect. It didn't end up getting published, as you could imagine. But the paper that I submitted was kind of on the theory behind why he was wrong, and the response to the article was, this is all too speculative. If only you had some evidence, some empirical evidence, then get back to us. But we can't publish it at the moment. It's just too speculative. Well, I've sent him the evidence now, so hopefully it will be. We'll see what happens. So yeah, this is a misapplication of self-determination theory, because this undermining effect only applies to behaviours that are already intrinsically motivated. Okay, it only applies to behaviours that are already intrinsically motivated. You know that experiment that I described a minute ago with the toddlers? They ran several trials before they even began the experiment, just to make sure that all the toddlers that they had were intrinsically motivated to engage in these helping behaviours. There was quite a large number. I think a third of the original sample didn't help at all, and they were excluded. Okay, like off you go, see you later. Okay, this finding just doesn't apply to you. So they were sent home. Okay, so this finding only applies to behaviours that are already intrinsically motivated. Okay, so the question is, what about unmotivated children? Okay, what about unmotivated children? Could rewards have a use there? And this has led some people to propose a lure hypothesis. This is what I call it. I call it the lure hypothesis. So Watts, Fullard and Peterson, they're from the Jubilee Centre. They kind of represent the Jubilee Centre's views. They've speculated that pupils may behave in certain ways because of the initial promise of a reward, but through the process they may come to realise the internal satisfaction of doing good and develop a habit of this behaviour. Okay, so that's kind of a statement of the law hypothesis. Okay, it's actually a really common idea. It's a really common proposition. It appears in education, philosophy, psychology, and I think it's the driving intuition behind many reward programs in schools as well. I have got some of the quotes that kind of demonstrate the law hypothesis. I won't read them just now though, but we can always return to those later on if people are interested. But it's untested, so it's a really common idea, but it's never been tested. And this puzzled me for a while. When I first started thinking about this, I thought I was just missing something, because it seems like such an obvious idea. Why isn't there any empirical evidence? Why hasn't there been any research, any experiments? I thought I hadn't found the papers yet, but they're not out there. This really genuinely hasn't been tested within this framework. So the question is why? And I've kind of got a speculative answer to the question as to why it hasn't been tested. So it's one thing to show that rewards can undermine motivation for an already intrinsically motivated behaviour. It's very different to try and use rewards to initiate intrinsic motivation for an unmotivated behaviour. Those are two very different things. And if you were going to try and test the second one, the law hypothesis, the experimenters would have to choose an activity. They'd have to ask themselves, okay, we want to see if we can lure children via rewards into developing intrinsic motivation for a certain behaviour. What behaviour should we choose? What activity should we choose? Which behaviours are ideally intrinsically motivated? And that's a normative question. That's a question that involves values. And scientists get frightened by those questions. They try to avoid those questions, okay? Scientists don't want to be seen to be prescribing certain behaviours. Okay, and I think that's kind of the best I've done at explaining why this law hypothesis hasn't been tested. It's because a lot of scientists are a bit skittish when it comes to these sorts of value-based questions. However, within the framework of character education, you know, there are behaviours that should be intrinsically motivated. They're the ones that we saw at the start on the first slide, things like honesty, kindness, justice, respect. Respect is an arguable one, but anyway, those sorts of moral behaviours. Okay, and it is a theoretically plausible suggestion. Okay, so I'll talk mainly about the first one. No, I'll mention both of them. I'm just conscious of time. So when you think about it, it's actually the opposite of the undermining effect. So the undermining effect says that rewards can undermine motivation in people who start off intrinsically motivated. Okay? The law hypothesis says that if you engage in a certain sort of behaviour, then that can prompt an inward shift in motivation in those who start off extrinsically motivated. So it's kind of looking at the undermining effect kind of inverted. Okay, so it is theoretically plausible for that reason. However, it does assume that some behaviours are internally satisfying, that there are some behaviours out there that could create this shift in motivation. And going back to those moral virtues, research has shown that engaging in gratitude, for example, gratitude practices, are inherently satisfying, internally satisfying. We've got certain needs within us, specifically the needs to feel competent, the need to feel a sense of belonging, and the need to feel autonomous. Engaging in gratitude practices can satisfy these needs, and if they satisfy those needs, it's more likely that you'll feel intrinsically motivated. Okay. Going back to, I didn't catch your name. What's your name? Sorry, Pete. Yeah, you mentioned at the start about maybe teachers, those more expert, a moment ago you mentioned maybe those more expert teachers find a different way to reward their students, not with tangible rewards. That's probably it. They satisfy their internal needs for things like competence, relatedness, and autonomy. And gratitude practices also satisfy those needs. So the point I'm trying to make is this idea, this law hypothesis, is untested, but it's plausible. It's theoretically plausible. Okay, and that's again what I tried to test with this with this experiment at Barr's Hill. And I'll go into the details of that experiment in just a moment. Any more questions at this point or comments? See how we're doing for time as well. Okay.
I had a question that I think was linked to the previous thing.
Yeah.
With Aristotle's thinking
Yeah.
about moral virtue.
Yeah, yeah.
Did Aristotle have a view on the acquisition and or teaching?
Yeah.
Because you said that he clearly had a view about a good life.
Yeah, yeah.
And what resonated with what you said is that that doesn't necessarily have to be a happy life.
Yeah.
But did he have a view on the education or the teaching of virtue?
Undoubtedly, yes, but infuriatingly, we don't have it, sadly. All we have of Aristotle's writings are lecture notes that we believe other students made in his lectures. Apparently, he did prepare long books for publication, and they probably were published, but we don't have them. They were lost to history, sadly. So he has all these wonderful ideas about what the good life consists in, but when it comes to the details of how to actually cultivate the good life, he's enigmatically silent because we've lost his writings. That said, there are certain pointers. He believed in the importance of early habituation, so role models in early childhood. In fact, he was a bit of a pessimist here, really, because he thought that if it went wrong before the age of 4, you'll never redeem that child. That's what he thought. One of the ways in which the Jubilee Centre is neo-Aristotelian is that they've kicked that. They've tried to move away from that. So they think that even if it's gone wrong in early childhood, they think that there are ways in which to redeem people and still turn them into, or turn them is the wrong phrase, but kind of support them, encourage them to kind of lead a more flourishing life. Yeah.
Age beyond 4.
Yeah. So different educational practices are suitable at different stages. In early childhood, so probably up until the age of 10, really, it's about trying to cultivate the right sorts of habits. And to do this, it's most important that young people come into contact with role models, good role models. And beyond the age of 10, it's about trying to kind of cultivate certain critical thinking or rational abilities, so that that the child has already got this foundation of moral habits, and then they start to think critically about them. And you can encourage them to do this in various different ways, especially by exposing them to dilemmas. So the child has been brought up to care about honesty and kindness, and then expose them to a situation where one seems to come at the cost of another. So for example, if you bumped into Chris in the corridor and Chris said, "Oh, do you like my new suit?" And you're stood there thinking, do I tell the truth and risk hurting Chris's feelings, or do I am I kind and save his feelings? So that would be a.
Please tell me what the right answer is.
So that would be an example of a dilemma, and via those sorts of dilemmas, you can start to encourage young people to start thinking more critically for themselves and re-evaluating their values and stuff. So there's a lot of good stuff out there on this. But good, excellent question. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions before we move on? I'll get into kind of the nitty-gritty of the actual experiment that I did.
Just got one thing.
Yeah.
Just in terms of with the stuff with Aristotle, following from
Yeah.
what you were saying, does there any comment about the natural inclination or natural disposition that some people may have to lead a virtuous life without any teaching?
Yeah.
Whether there's any sense that some people just have a natural disposition to be empathetic and kind.
Yeah.
Whereas some people need much more encouragement and teaching to do so. And I suppose conversely, does he also then say that therefore some people have a disposition to reject virtue completely, regardless of what you do?
We are kind of steering away from my main area of kind of expertise, I would say. I mean, I'm happy to kind of venture some kind of rough answers, but I'm definitely not I wouldn't say I'm describing an expert on kind of like the cultivation of like empathy and stuff like this. But I'll go back to kind of the point about kind of early habit formation. he wouldn't have thought that young people children come into the world predisposed to kind of be a certain way when they grew up. He thought that it was all about early habituation, cultivating the right sorts of habits in them when they were young. And if you get that right, they're on the right path for the rest of their life. If you get it wrong, Aristotle thought that it was very hard, maybe even impossible to redeem them. But that's been shown to be kind of, modern psychology and modern research has shown that you can be a bit more optimistic there on that point. But yeah, it's a really good question. He wouldn't have thought that, if you want to contrast him with Rousseau, for example, Rousseau thought that everyone comes into the world good and is slowly corrupted. Hobbes thought that everyone came into the world bad and had to be kind of conditioned into being good by society. Aristotle wouldn't have held either of those views. He would have thought that you kind of come in a bit more of a blank slate, and then it's kind of your early upbringing that makes the difference, I would say. Yeah, good question. Nice. Right, okay, so I'll talk about the experiment that I actually ran now. Okay? Right, so this is a statement of the law hypothesis. This is the hypothesis, the claim that I'm trying to test in school. Okay, so engaging in internally satisfying, virtuous behaviour can prompt an inward shift in motivation in children who start off motivated through rewards. Okay, so that's a statement of the law hypothesis. I've highlighted this bit here because if I'm gonna test this hypothesis, I'm going to need to have a virtuous activity to test it on. Okay, I'm going to need a virtuous activity, and over the next 3 slides, I'll change the highlighted part of the hypothesis and show how I tried to kind of operationalise each part of it to actually test it with an experiment. Okay, so we needed a virtuous activity. When I first started thinking about this a few years ago, I thought, well, a nice one would be maybe to take children into a nearby old people's home, get them to spend time with residents. That sort of intervention has been done in other character education studies, and it can be quite rewarding, but logistically difficult. So I decided to move away from that idea, and I ended up deciding on gratitude journaling. Okay, and you actually have the gratitude journaling sheet in front of you. So it's a sheet with 5 lines on it, and it says, think back over the past week and write down 5 things in your life that you are grateful or thankful for. Okay. As you can imagine, getting them to this activity is going to be far easier logistically than taking them into the nearest old people's home. So this was, I felt that this was an improvement, a better idea. But we also need a comparison group. Okay, if we're really going to test these kind of causal claims, you need to have a group that doesn't receive the intervention that you can compare with. Okay, and so we've also got generic journaling. So you've also got a sheet in front of you that says think back over the past week and write down 5 things that you have done. Okay, so much more generic journaling. Okay, and the idea here is that. Oh, I'll get onto that in a moment, okay, because I'm just going to talk specifically about the activity just for now. Okay, so we've got these 2 sheets. One group of students were going to do the gratitude journaling. The other group were going to do the generic journaling, just writing about things they've done. Okay, and the journaling sessions would be at lunchtime on a Tuesday in adjacent classrooms. So I looked after the gratitude journaling group, or just supervised them whilst they did the activity, and a colleague looked after the generic journaling group. Okay, we didn't give them any feedback. Okay, we basically just gave them the sheets and let them get on with it. Okay, and the activities happened over 6 weeks. Okay, and so it's important just to think for a moment about what the law hypothesis would predict would happen with these 2 activities. Okay, so the idea is that gratitude journaling is going to be more internally satisfying. So there's something about gratitude journaling that's going to be more internally satisfying than generic journaling. Okay, and if that's the case, that assumption, by the way, is supported by research. Research does suggest that there's something more internally satisfying about gratitude journaling versus generic journaling. Okay, so on that assumption, the law hypothesis would predict that those doing the gratitude journaling should see greater gains in intrinsic motivation compared to those doing the generic journaling. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, good. Right, so that's the activity. That's the activity, and that's what the law hypothesis says about the two activities. Okay. Now, shifting the emphasis from the activity to the students. Okay. If I'm going to test the law hypothesis, I need to recruit a load of students who are only extrinsically motivated. I need to filter out the intrinsically motivated ones, and I did that with a script. Okay, which you also have on your tables. So over the course of several tutor periods over a week, I went into different tutor groups, and I essentially kind of put on a bit of a performance for them. Okay, so I went into the room, I said, good morning everyone, I'm Mr. Brown. I'm here this morning to talk to you about a new enrichment opportunity. The activity is journaling. Journaling is where you regularly write down your thoughts, feelings and experiences. You could write about things you have done recently or things you are grateful for. Starting next week, journaling sessions will take place every Tuesday lunchtime for 6 weeks, taking us up to the end of term. Each session will last around half an hour. Put your hand up if you think you would like to get involved. Okay? Students who put their hands up at that point, I got tutors to make a note of their names. Okay? And then I was like, oh, thank you, great, wonderful. Like I pretended to leave, and then I came back and I said, oh, I forgot to mention. Each time you get involved in these activities, you'll earn 20 pride points. Okay, and then a load more hands typically shot up into the air. Okay, and that's how I identified my extrinsically motivated participants. Okay, I filtered out the ones who put their hands up initially, so they were excluded from the studies. The ones who wanted to, it was a bit, I mean, it does raise some ethical issues, I should talk about it later. But the ones who wanted to do journaling purely for the sake of journaling, these innocent souls didn't get to do it, yeah. And it was only the ones who put their hands up afterwards who were involved in the study. And there were 17 students who put their hands up, the innocent souls who just wanted to do journaling, who were excluded. Then 61 volunteered after the mention of rewards, okay, and those 61 were allocated to either the gratitude journaling or the generic journaling, okay. They weren't informed of their allocation, so it's kind of partial blinding, but obviously some of them figured out that after a couple of weeks that they were doing slightly different activities. Tutors reminded students about journaling each week, okay, and that's how I recruited my extrinsically motivated students. Okay. Okay, good. Oh, there was one thing I was going to mention. There was a really interesting interaction in one of the recruitment sessions. So I'd already done my little performance, and then I'd mentioned rewards, and a boy shot his hand up straight up when I mentioned the rewards, and a girl sat opposite him said, "You're only doing it for the rewards." And he looked really sheepish and lowered his hand. And I think a few others lowered their hands as well. This girl was clearly quite a dominant personality, and she seemed to have this idea that doing something only for a reward was somehow bad, and she was telling off the other students, which is very interesting because the boy who kind of lowered his hand rather sheepishly, he was bowing to social pressure. And that's another form of extrinsic motivation. So, you know, he had a choice between the reward, one form of extrinsic motivation, or social approval, and that's another form of extrinsic motivation, and he opted for the latter. You know, he made that decision. He thought it was more important to stay in with my peer group than not to be alienated from my peer group than to have the reward. I thought that was really, really interesting. But yeah, that's just an aside. So I've got my extrinsically motivated students. Now I need to measure their motivation. Okay, and I did this with an intrinsic motivation inventory. So that's a self-report, a little questionnaire that you've got in front of you. Okay, they filled in this sheet, okay, stating by circling a number how much they agreed with each of these statements, okay, and that allowed me to measure their intrinsic motivation. And the inventory has 3 subscales, okay, 3 subscales. So some of the questions relate to interest and enjoyment, some of the questions relate to perceived choice, and some of the questions relate to value/usefulness, okay? And these are 3 different aspects of intrinsic motivation, all right? And I got them to fill in this survey 3 times Okay, after the second journaling session, after the final journaling session, and 3 weeks later. So they filled it in 3 times. I'd originally planned for them to fill it in after the first journaling session. Obviously, that was meant to be the baseline measure. But after all my careful planning, I put the wrong room on the posters. So there was a logistical issue in the first week, and we had to delay the first measurement, the first survey, until the second week. Okay, but I think that's okay. I don't think that should cause too many problems. Okay, now finally, we want to kind of figure out whether we can prompt an inward shift. All right. And to do that, I used a statistical test called a mixed factorial ANOVA. We don't really need to go into that, but I just thought it was worth mentioning. Okay, and this bit is important. The Lohr hypothesis predicts a group time interaction. Now that's a bit confusing, but what it basically means is over time, those doing the gratitude journaling should see greater intrinsic motivation than those doing the generic journaling. Okay, that's called a group time interaction. It basically just means that over time there'll be a difference between the two groups. Okay, so that's what I was looking for. That's what I was trying to find with this statistical test. I was trying to see if there was a group time interaction. Okay, good. And right, so you remember I started off with these 61 extrinsically motivated students. They were only included in the final data analysis if they satisfied these 3 conditions, and only 22 did. So I went from 61 students who initially expressed an interest in getting involved in the journaling down to 22 who met all the final criteria. Okay, so heavy attrition, lots of students dropped out, which is interesting in itself. I'll talk more about that in just a moment. Okay, good. Now there were some ethical issues, as I've already touched on. Okay, I couldn't tell the students about the study because that could affect their motivation. So I gained institutional approval instead. So the head teacher at Barr's Hill gave me her consent on behalf of participants after I fully briefed her on the experiment, which is an okay way of operating. You know, that's not seen as kind of shifty or dodgy in psychological research. You know, there's loads of studies where you can't really tell participants fully what you're doing. So I got consent off the head teacher instead. The fact that we were using rewards to encourage participation could have led to some students feeling a bit coerced, but they were reminded regularly that there are lots of other opportunities to kind of earn pride points at school, and you can drop out at any point, and quite a few students did, so hopefully that wasn't an issue. And excluding the pure innocent souls who wanted to do it just for the sake of journaling, they were told initially that the activity was oversubscribed. There were just too many people interested, and some people just weren't going to be able to do it that term, and they drew the short straw, sadly. But they would have the same opportunity to do it the following term instead. And I also positively redirected their kind of, their motivation. I basically recruited them into being character leader ambassadors at the school. That's still kind of an ongoing project, but yeah, I said, the fact that you've volunteered for these for this activity before there was any mention of rewards, it's really fantastic. Like, would you be interested in getting involved in these character leadership roles? So hopefully that mitigated any psychological damage that would have been done by excluding them. I think it should. I think they all seemed fine. Okay, good. So that's how I tested the Lohr hypothesis. Any questions or comments at this point? How are we doing for time? I just want to make sure we're doing all right. Yeah, I'm going to speed up a little bit. Go on, yeah.
So just so I'm clear, so the 2 groups, they were both getting rewards.
Yes. Yes, they were. Yeah, that's correct.
The only difference was the actual activity
Yeah.
they did.
Yes, that's right, yeah. So the only difference was one group was doing gratitude journaling, the other was doing generic journaling. They were all getting rewards. They all did it every lunchtime on a Tuesday for 6 weeks. And I measured their intrinsic motivation with these surveys 3 times.
Right. So are you not testing the difference between gratitude journaling and standard journaling, rather than the reward being the difference?
So so there's an assumed difference between gratitude journaling and generic journaling.
Yeah.
The assumption being that gratitude journaling is more internally satisfying. Okay, and I'm measuring to see whether that has an effect on intrinsic motivation. Okay, so the journaling is what's described as the independent variable. and the intrinsic motivation was the dependent variable. I was seeing whether the different types of journaling produced a differential effect on intrinsic motivation.
Right.
That's what I was trying to do.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. Go on, Callum.
Okay. Now, this is by no means a criticism
Yes.
of the research.
No, please
because
do.
I
Yeah.
find
Go
it
on.
Really fascinating.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, is there a bias at play here?
Yeah.
And no doubt you've already considered this.
Yeah.
But because the setting is in a classroom with teachers there,
Yeah.
and that is so similar to the setting that they'd usually work or learn in,
Yeah.
how can we be certain that this is truly intrinsic motivation and not just the same extrinsic motivation
Yeah.
that they get in every other classroom?
Yeah, really, really good question. So, I mean, we can be fairly certain at the start of the 6 weeks anyway that they are purely extrinsically motivated, because I filtered out all the intrinsically motivated ones. So these surveys really were used to track changes in motivation. You know, I wasn't going to kind of conclude that they'd made a full objective shift to a new type of motivation. I was more interested in just tracking any changes, tracking any differences, and that's what these surveys allowed me to do. Does that kind of answer the question a little bit?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
It's just they're shifting more towards...
Yeah.
So you're
Yeah.
imagining it's a scale then?
Yeah.
Of
Yeah.
extrinsic to intrinsic?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Okay, good. Right, I will move on. Okay, good. So here were the results. So I will just say quickly about the attrition. So 22 students, they made up the final sample. Obviously, we started with 61. This was the biggest loss of students here. So 61 students initially expressed an interest. Only 33 came to the first journaling session. So I lost almost half, just didn't show up. Okay. Then 31 came to the second journaling session and filled in the first intrinsic motivation inventory. Then there was a bit more attrition. Like I lost a few more students kind of down here to the final 22. You'll notice 23 completed the final intrinsic motivation inventory, but I only included 22 in the final sample because one student didn't provide assent for me to use their data. So after the final intrinsic motivation inventory, I had them all together and I explained what I'd done. You know, I came clean. I was like, you've all been participating in a study, and I now need you to kind of sign these forms that say you're happy for me to use your data in my experiment. And I also sent a letter home to give parents the opportunity if they didn't want their students to be involved. And one girl didn't. She said, "No, I don't want to give you my assent to use my data." And I was like, "Absolutely fine. Yeah, I won't use your data. Not a problem. Can I ask why?" I was just curious. I was quite curious. And she said, "I've been told never to sign things," which is interesting, isn't it? And that was it. She said, "I've been told never to sign things." So that's just kind of a big question mark left over that one. So I didn't use her data. She was excluded from the study. Okay, so right now, a summary of the findings. So we had the 3 different subscales, if you remember. Okay, the 3 different aspects of intrinsic motivation. Okay, and we were looking in particular for a group time interaction. So we were looking for any differences across the 2 groups over time, and there were none. Okay, there were none. Okay, so these highlighted yellow parts meant that there were no significant group time interactions. There were no differences between the groups, basically. In fact, there was only one significant effect, and that was a main effect of time for perceived choice. Okay, and I'm going to get more into that in a moment. That basically means that over the course of the 6 weeks, it didn't matter whether students were doing generic journaling or gratitude journaling, they came to see their behaviour as more autonomous. Okay, but there was no difference across the groups there. Okay, no difference across the groups. Didn't matter what group they were in. Okay, and once you've identified a significant effect, you then ask yourself, okay, where was the effect? And the effect was from pre to post. Okay, so what that means is, over the 6 weeks that students were doing journaling, doesn't matter whether it was generic or gratitude, they came to see their behaviour as more autonomous. But then it dropped off again. Because if you remember, I measured intrinsic motivation again 3 weeks later, okay, during a tutor period, and the effect wasn't sustained, it had disappeared. So it was only during the 6 weeks that students came to see their behaviour as more autonomous, more self-governing, And then it dropped off again, which is very interesting, very, very interesting. And it didn't differ across the groups. That's the important point. It didn't differ across the groups. Okay, and that's a visual representation. So the significant effect was this bit here. So perceived choice, okay, from pre to post, that's the 6-week period. It was that bit there that was significant, okay, that raise there, that increase there, and as you can see, it then dropped off and disappeared here. But that increase there was significant. Okay, cool. Right, so I'm conscious of time, so I will just rush on to the discussion section. Okay, I'm going to discuss my findings in a bit more detail, and then we're near the end anyway. So if you've got any additional questions or comments, then we can come back to them in a minute. Okay, so let's have a look. So the Lohr hypothesis predicted a group time interaction, so a difference across the two groups. Okay, none emerged, as we saw a moment ago. None emerged. Okay, there was no group time interaction. This doesn't necessarily mean that the Lohr hypothesis is false. Okay, what it could mean is that the generic journaling and the gratitude journaling were a bit too similar. Okay, maybe there wasn't a significant difference between the two. Maybe some of the students who were writing, who should have been writing about things they were grateful for, just wrote about more random things. And maybe some of the students who were doing generic journaling ended up writing about things they were grateful for. So maybe in practice, the two activities weren't different enough to produce a different effect across the groups. Okay, that's one explanation. Or the study just lacked statistical power. That means that there weren't enough participants, okay, in the study. So a good way to, my supervisor explained this to me because I was confused about statistical power for a while as well. Imagine you were looking for a needle in a haystack. It would help to have lots of people looking for it. Okay, so imagine, so if it's only going to be a small effect, it helps to have lots of participants. Okay, if you're looking for an anvil in a haystack, so if it's going to have a big effect, then you could probably find it with fewer people. Okay, so maybe there was a small effect between the two groups, but I just didn't have enough participants to detect it. Okay, so yeah, so it doesn't necessarily falsify the Lohr hypothesis, but one pattern did emerge, which we mentioned a moment ago. There was this increase in perceived choice or perceived autonomy across the two groups. Okay, irrespective of whether they were doing generic or gratitude journaling. Okay, good. That's good. Right. So this contradicts what Berkowitz was saying. So earlier on, you had Berkowitz, who is really against rewards. Okay, he said in particular that that rewards are at best ineffective and at worst counterproductive to flourishing. Okay, what the results here suggest is that he's wrong. You know, because all of these students started off intrinsically motivated, but they made some gains in autonomy. They came to feel more autonomous over time. Okay.
Is it okay to go ahead on Monday then?
Say again?
Is that okay to go ahead on Monday?
Yes. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean.
Happening either way now.
Yeah. It's too late. So you've got some grounding now. If you want to cite me, by all means. Right, okay, good. And this also aligns with broader formulations of the Lohr hypothesis. So there are broader formulations that kind of just say that rewards can have a positive effect on later behaviour without necessarily specifying what that effect is. This seems to kind of support those more general formulations of the Lohr hypothesis. Okay, and in general, findings tentatively suggest that rewards may help initiate rather than impede the early stages of internalisation. Okay, but this raises the question why? Why did this happen? So why did students come to feel more autonomous over the 6 weeks, regardless of journaling activity? Why did they make these gains in autonomy? And there's been some really interesting research on consumption habits. So why do consumers consume in the way they do? And one of the results from that research is that consumers with stronger habits report greater certainty in their intentions. Okay, so basically, consumers with stronger habits report feeling more autonomous about what they're doing. Okay, so what this suggests in this context is that students might have come to feel more autonomous about what they were doing as the activities became part of their weekly routine. So they developed the habit and then the feeling of autonomy came afterwards. Okay, it kind of just became part of their weekly routine. They became very used to it. They got used to me and the rooms and the activities, and they ended up seeing the behaviour as more self-chosen than it had originally been when they were just doing it for the rewards. Okay, and this is really interesting, by the way, because this suggests that you need to form habits first, and feelings of autonomy come later. Okay, and there is some debate in the literature about which way around these two things come, but my research seems to suggest that it's the habits that come first and the feelings of autonomy come later. Okay. And this also explains why that increase in perceived autonomy dropped off 3 weeks later, because they'd stopped doing the journaling. There was no they weren't doing the journaling anymore. It disappeared from their weekly routine, and so they didn't feel autonomous with respect to it anymore. It was gone. Okay, good. Fantastic. Right, now, educational implications. This is probably the bit that you're most interested in regarding your Pride Point shops. Okay, so what this suggests is that really close attention needs to be paid to the kind of habits that are being cultivated. Okay, so in my study, students came to feel more autonomous whether they were doing virtuous gratitude journaling or whether they were doing generic, morally neutral generic journaling. Okay, they came to feel more autonomous just because the activities were incorporated into their weekly habits. You know, and the same sort of principle might apply to negative behaviours. You know, a child who happens to find themselves engaging in bullying on a fairly regular basis might come to see that behaviour as more self-chosen than it was originally. Okay, so this suggests that we end up feeling autonomous about the sorts of things that we find ourselves doing. Okay, the sorts of habits that we form. Autonomy follows afterwards. Okay, so really close attention needs to be paid to the kind of habits being cultivated, whether we're using rewards to cultivate those habits or whatever else. You know, really close attention needs to be paid to those habits. Okay, good. Now, the other point to note is that you might try and introduce a reward system or have a system of pride points or whatever it is to start shaping the habits of your young people. But most habits probably aren't cultivated with conscious, deliberate strategies like that. Like, I think most habits are cultivated through unconscious social assimilation. You know, just being in the presence of role models, teachers, parents, friends, whoever it might be. And this does stress the importance of role models. It really does. It really stresses the importance of role models. And it also stresses the importance of trying to make all of these murky, unconscious or subconscious processes of character development or moral development more consciousness, you know, dragging them up from the dark and into the light and trying to make them more conscious and more deliberate. Okay? Good. I won't linger on this because, I won't linger on this for now. But there are some, you know, significant limitations with this study. As I already mentioned, small sample size, and I only measured intrinsic motivation with a survey. Okay, the surveys have all sorts of problems with them. Okay, because students can just be completely wrong about what they're writing down. They might have really, you know, their introspective skills might be really weak. They might just be randomly putting in numbers. Okay, the fact that I used a control group kind of mitigates some of those concerns because I can still track changes over time. But still, you know, self-report measures aren't typically seen as a fantastic way to measure things. You know, you want to try and include behavioural measures as well. Okay, good. Excellent. Right, okay, so that's kind of it for my lecture, for my talk. What I've put on the board here is essentially just a summary of what we've discussed at length already. Okay. Thank you so much for listening. You can contact me on that email address at the bottom there, or you can find me on my website. And that would be the end of my talk. And I'll welcome any other questions or comments. I didn't realise we were going to take as much time as we have done, but I think technically we've got about 7 minutes left.